everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today we are returning to a series we've been putting on with my friends at the DLD conference in Munich, who are celebrating the 20th year anniversary of their first show in January of next year. And in association with DLD, we've been looking back over these last 20 years, talking with prominent DLDers about what has and hasn't changed in this remarkable period. Today we're talking with my old friend, Jeff Jarvis, who has been to DLD many times. And as always in this series, I began by asking Jeff what he was doing in January of 2005.
In January 2005, I heard about this new conference in Germany called DLD. I don't remember what it stood for at the time. It held in a castle somewhere in Bavaria. And afterwards, I had FOMO. I wish I'd been there because I heard it was really good.
And then you went, Jeff. How many times did you attend DLD?
Oh, at least a dozen times, I think. And it was always amazing. It has a spirit like no other conference I've ever seen. The funny thing about it is that there's not enough room in the places where the events are going on because they love the hallway. They love people being out, meeting each other. The amazing thing about Steffi Czerny and Dr. Burda is that they are the greatest connectors I've ever seen in life. You get literally dragged over. You must talk to so-and-so. You must meet so-and-so. And they connect you, and then they go off and make the next connection and the next connection. And that was what the DLD has really been about, is those connections. Yes, they had great content, great talks, really smart people, interesting people. But in the end, DLD was all about that hallway.
And does that, metaphorically or otherwise, reflect the architecture of the digital revolution, a place without a center or all edges?
I think it really does, because the internet is about connections. The internet is a connected world, and that's what DLD and Burda have been about in many ways. I remember meeting Dr. Burda some years before, when they launched Focus magazine with its founder, and then I got to meet him as he was interested in digital technologies. And Dr. Burda was always beginning very enthusiastic about that, very curious, wanting to be around the smart young people who were making the internet happen. That's a lot of what DLD did, was it wanted to create a magnet to bring those people in. And because it's always held just before the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, then you can gather together smart people and powerful people and rich people in the same room.
Jeff, you've spent a lot of time in Europe over the last 20 years. I think you speak German, so you're particularly familiar. Well, you're particularly familiar with the German economy. One of the things that seems to have happened over the last 20 years is an increasing economic divide between Europe and the United States. Is that fair? Why has it happened? And is it being driven by digital innovation, or perhaps the lack of digital innovation?
I go way back in the 90s when I was doing, among other things, investments for the Newhouses, and we invested in a German company at the time, and so I hung around with the kind of innovators DLD brings in. And I heard a consistent complaint, which is that you could maybe get your first money in Europe, in Germany, but the bigger investments, you couldn't get there because the appetite for risk was not high enough. And that's how a lot of the brain drain occurred from Europe to go out into American funders and draw towards Silicon Valley. And so I've long criticized Germany and Europe for not investing sufficiently. There's a jealousy. France wanted to start their own Google. Well, start the new thing that's different from that. Germany, I've long said, should be the company that would do privacy better than anyone else because it matters to them. Datenschutz, data protection. And I do see interesting things happening there, of course. But there has long been a overcautious culture, I think, about investment and risk.
Burda, of course, invested a significant amount of capital in their own search engine. They wanted to compete with Google, or at least become the anti-Google. Is that another example of where Europeans have lacked real innovation, always trying to replicate the American model?
Yeah, there was one company, Rocket, that made a business of copying American companies so the copied American companies would buy the copy. And that worked pretty well for a while. They made a lot of money doing that. But I always heard a lot of frustration in Germany knowing that was not a proper model for innovation. Again, there is innovation there. It happens in lots of places. Jochen Wegner used to be the editor at Focus, and now he's the editor of Zeit Online. And he does things in media and journalism that are innovative worldwide. Nordic companies, Schibsted, are doing great innovative things in journalism right now. There's certainly lots of innovation in Europe, just never enough to satisfy the Europeans.
One of my connections that I most cherish from DLD was meeting Margaret Vestager, the EU Commissioner on antitrust, on monopolies. I'm guessing you're probably not as big a fan of her as I am. What the Europeans seem to have excelled at over the last 20 years is regulation. I know you're not a big fan of that, but do you accept that some of that was valuable over the last 20 years, that the Europeans have led and now Americans are beginning to recognize that big tech does need to be regulated?
I think the discussion is certainly worthwhile. I think that the forms of regulation that occurred were often with unintended consequences. The aim was to take power away from the big American companies, but the right to be forgotten put the power of deciding what's remembered in Google's hands. NetzDG in Germany was trying to get rid of hate speech. It then enabled Facebook, it required Facebook to decide what was malicious hate speech, and so it ended up with more power in their hands. The Leistungsschutzrecht, which is the ancillary copyright that was passed in Germany, a link tax, a snippet tax, didn't end up fully taking charge there because the publishers realized they needed the big companies. It then became the link tax in Spain. It then became the copyright changes in Europe as a whole, and then Australia and so on. But that is not innovation. And I don't think it's really led to necessarily a better internet or certainly a better business view in Europe. And I'm not against regulation. I'm for smart regulation and for smart discussion. I just think that too much of the regulation in Germany and Europe was knee-jerk and emotional.
Do you have a particular DLD anecdote? You and I have both attended it many times, and when I think of you, you're always so diligent. You're always sitting in the front row, taking notes, asking questions. You're sometimes in the hallway, of course, chatting with Yossi and everyone. But is there one particular anecdote that somehow captures what DLD is all about? This, by the way, this show is not an advertisement for DLD. They're not paying me for this series, so I'm just curious.
There's a lot of them. I think what I recall is one time sitting on the stage, and as I remember, Michael Arrington was on the stage and others, and Dr. Burda got up, and Dr. Burda had been, again, a great enthusiast for the internet. He believed in it. I sat in his office with his lieutenants talking about all the great things that were happening on it, and he was always curious and always loved it. But at this particular DLD, I forget which year it was, he stood up in the audience and he said, the internet promised us that we were going to make more money and easier, and all we ended up with were these lousy pennies. And that phrase has lived on, I think, certainly within the company's culture, but also in European media culture, is the lousy pennies. And it was a statement of disappointment.
And do you share that?
I think that it was wrong to think that we were all going to get richer on the internet. The internet was going to have to make us more efficient. The internet was going to cut out middlemen. We should have seen and did see all of that. But I think it gave us more than lousy pennies. I think the internet gave us a great deal. And Steffi and the DLD folks still know that. They bring in innovators from the internet because they value that.
You mentioned Mike Arrington, one of the founding bloggers, of course, the founder of TechCrunch, which has gone on to bigger and better things, at least in some people's mind. You were another pioneering blogger. I think you started blogging before Arrington. You began, in about
2001.
2001. So by 2005, you were in full flight as a blogger, in a positive sense. The blogging revolution was happening. Cast your mind back to that period, Jeff. How exciting was it?
Well, I'll confess first that I was first shown Blogger, one of the early platforms for blogging, by Nick Denton, my friend who started Gawker Media and other things. And we had invested an advance in one of his companies, and I was on the board of that company. And Nick very excitedly one day said, I've got to show you this, I've got to show you this. And he sat down and he brought up Blogger and he typed something in and then he hit a button and then he showed me it was a web page. And I said, what's the big deal? Nick, you made a web page. We can all make web pages. I didn't see it at first, I will confess. But after I survived the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, I started blogging. And Nick sent one of my posts to a friend and of his who blogged about it and linked back to me, and I responded and I linked back to him, and that was a life-changing moment when I saw that blogging was properly conceived as a conversation happening in different times and different places, that this was the proper sense of media that we had lost through a century of mass media. And that changed my view of my career and of the world. And so blogging was exciting then. I went to the first blogger cons. Dave Weiner, who was a pioneer blogger, one of the founders of RSS and podcasting, he created these conferences where we got together and we were conservative and liberal in the same room and we liked each other and it seemed wonderful.
Yeah, Reynolds was there too as a conservative. I think I was at some of those early ones. But it seems to me, Jeff, that Weiner's like you, I guess, in a sense, that it really got to your core. It wasn't just about doing a different kind of journalism. It wasn't just about technology. I never knew a Jeff Jarvis before the internet, before blogging. Did it fundamentally change you? What did your wife think when you came home? What happened to the old Jeff Jarvis?
No, I don't think it changed me, but it did bring out my core. It was what I was about.
And you didn't have it before, so it was almost as if you discovered your core through it.
Well, I'd been when I was in the San Francisco Examiner, I was a columnist writing 6 days a week, so I was used to blathering about what I thought and being public to that extent. So it was kind of like blogging, but the difference now was people could talk back to me and they could link to me and they could argue with me, and that was what was important. So it took what I was already doing as a journalist and a critic too, and put it online, but then made it fully interactive.
You embraced, Jeff, in the 20 years, the idea of publicness. You even wrote a book about it. You were very public in some of your health issues. Do you regret any of that?
No. Because there's only one person who complained when I wrote about my prostate cancer, and he complained that I was oversharing. And
Who was that?
I can't remember his name, a forgettable person, but I told him that he was over listening. If you don't want to hear about it, fine. There's a whole internet out there. Just ignore me. That's okay. I got support. I got help from people. There was a generosity that came out. Since then, when people get prostate cancer or thyroid cancer, I sometimes come in and say, well, here's what my experience was. I'm no expert, but I'm willing to share. I think there's a generosity about doing that. No regrets whatsoever. But that's me. I'm public. I'm also a white, male, cisgender, tenured professor, so it's easy for me. I'm not necessarily under attack by like vulnerable people are online. But I don't regret my publicness on the internet.
Is there a darker side to this over the last 20 years, Jeff? Last weekend I was in Sonoma with my wife, and it seemed as if everyone around us was being photographed and broadcasting themselves endlessly online. You're not much of a narcissist, but this culture does lend itself to narcissism, doesn't it?
I could also argue it lends itself to sharing. It lends itself to making connection. In my engagement journalism classes with my colleague Carrie Brown, we used to go around the room and ask people to say, what community are you a member of? And the first person would say something obvious. I'm a student. I live in Brooklyn, and so on. But then someone around the room, almost inevitably, would say, I struggle with mental health issues. And then someone else in the room would say, I too struggle with mental health issues. And they were in a safe space where they could say that. And a connection was made. And you can only make that connection when you feel you can reveal yourself to that extent. The hard part, the dark side of the internet, is that people who reveal themselves sometimes are attacked for it. The malign forces will come in and go after people. That's the bad part of the internet. Bad people. We've always had bad people, and it brings them out and empowers them and enables them online. But again, it's easier for me to say this because I'm not a vulnerable person in that sense, but when I find assholes, I block them. And my feeds, even on Twitter, I won't call it X, are still useful and beneficial and enjoyable. All the better on Blue Sky, which I quite like, and Mastodon and Threads is okay too. Facebook a little less so these days. I'm in all these places because I value the conversations there still.
Jeff, things have changed dramatically, for better or worse, over the last 20 years. Back in 2005, in January 2005, when DLD began, there was a great deal of optimism, hope. This was the height of the Web 2.0 optimism. Now we have the Australian government banning social media. We have all sorts of skepticism, all sorts of support for one kind of technological regulation or another. Was there a moment in these last 20 years where you recognized that the zeitgeist was shifting when you look back? Or was it as if we were all frogs in being boiled and we didn't realize we were done until we were done?
A very interesting researcher named Neeraj Weiss-Blatt wrote a book called Techlash. And
being on the show, actually, at your suggestion.
Good. So she did a content analysis as a real researcher, a content analysis of coverage of the internet, and she found a sharp turn on a dime, and a moment when coverage of the internet turned from optimistic to pessimistic, even dystopian. And that moment was the election in 2016 of Donald Trump. And one could find many reasons behind that. Media wanted someone else to blame. They blamed the internet, or the mood of the nation changed, or we saw the power of malign forces. Whatever it might be, I think that was indeed the moment. There were attacks from businesses on the internet before. Wall Street Journal started attacking Google in 2010. There was a shifting zeitgeist. I think that was true, but I think the first election of Donald Trump was probably a watershed moment for the culture of the net.
Analysts like Jonathan Haidt, I know you're not a great fan of his work, but he's very influential and popular, have argued that something changed in 2012, particularly in terms of this, what he sees at least as an epidemic of anxiety. Is there any truth to that? I mean, I take your point on Trump in 2016, but was something changing already before that in terms of how people thought of themselves and their relationship with technology? Everyone was carrying their phones with them everywhere they went. Of course, in 2005, there was no iPhone.
Jonathan Haidt has what I think is an incredibly simplistic and dangerous analysis. When he and Jean Twenge try to blame everything on the phone. That is horribly simplistic. It is a distraction. It ignores the fact that young women are no longer in control of their bodies at the Supreme Court, that children in this country go to school afraid of being shot, that they're unsure of their economic future, they're unsure of the climate future. We have fascism at the door. Yeah, sure, let's blame it on the phones. That means that we are distracted.
I'm not necessarily a defender of Haidt, but I think he might respond. In 2012, Trump wasn't running for office, and we see a real shift in anxiety.
But we see, if you look at, there's an effort to select statistics conveniently. They look at, in various of their writings, they looked at the suicide rate, ignoring that it was equal or higher in the 90s before the internet. And then, so they then try to blame the internet and blame the phone. And the problem with that is that it means that we don't then address the bigger issues at hand. Is the phone a factor with certain people? Of course it is. But it's a true case of a moral entrepreneur and moral panic trying to find one single boogeyman to blame everything on, and then to act as a salvation, as a savior, trying to argue that if we just deal with that one boogeyman, if you turned off every phone tomorrow, we end up in Valhalla? No, it's simplistic, it's stupid, it's dangerous, it's perilous, but it sells books a lot better than mine.
Jeff, when historians later in the 21st century look back at this period, 2005 to 25, are there particular critical moments? Snowden, perhaps, the failure of Occupy, the Arab Spring. I mean, leaving aside the technological stuff, obviously the Great Recession. Are there moments that for you captured what has happened over the last 20 years to explain everything?
I think you just listed them pretty much. We can also look at the corporate view of the growth of Facebook and where that took off, the birth of Twitter in 2007 as a phenomenon. And people complain that Twitter does not affect everybody, but it affected a lot of people. It certainly affected media. It affected public discourse. It distracted me from doing my blog loyally, and I was distracted to go to Twitter. I think that was a major change. But I also think it's very early days still on the internet. A lot of folks think that we're far enough along to be able to know what it is and regulate it. But if you look back at print, it was 150 years after Gutenberg before we saw great innovation with print, with the invention of the modern novel with Cervantes and the essay with Montaigne and market for printed plays with Shakespeare and the newspaper. It took a century and a half. So my theory is that we're early days in the internet still.
That's the Chow and Lai reading of the internet. I think wasn't he asked about what he thought of the French Revolution, and he suggested too early to tell. Yeah.
I also was debating a German regulator in Perugia at the International Journalism Festival some time ago, and I said, after Gutenberg, I was joking, there came along the 30 Years' War. Maybe we have a 30 Years' War ahead. And the German regulator said, with no irony, it's too soon to joke about that.
Well, I'm not going to make any jokes about German irony. So what about for you, Jeff, these 20 years? You've been a successful writer, entrepreneur, public speaker. You have a close relationship with Craig Newmark. You've developed all sorts of programs. What are you most proud about what you've achieved personally over the last 20 years, either professionally or personally?
I think what matters to me is that I created a program in engagement journalism with my colleague Carrie Brown, which is about teaching students to listen better and to serve communities. And the students that come out of that program have been amazing. The program has changed and paused at the school where we were, and Carrie Brown and I are both now working at new universities. We're going to work together at Montclair State on engagement. And I think that it goes on. It's become a bit of a movement in journalism education. So I'm very proud of that.
Do you have any regrets? I mean, if you were doing these 20 years again?
Sure, of course I do. I think we were too optimistic, and I mean that by that, mainly technology companies, but I was part of that. There were moments when I was an asshole online, and you and I probably went at it too hard. My old joke was that I used to have the Cabernet rule. Don't go online after too much Cabernet, but I found the loophole was called Pinot Noir, and so I would still go online, and I'm sure I was nasty to people in ways that I would cringe at seeing today. I try to be better today. I made mistakes. I think deserting my blog, I still blog, but not being as devoted to it and going to Twitter was a mistake. Not that I wouldn't be on Twitter at the same time, but I think I misprioritized where public conversation discourse should be. I ran into Dave Weiner, who's one of the great innovators
and characters. I mean, a remarkable fellow.
He's amazing. He helped create podcasting. He helped create RSS. He was early on in blogging. He's done a great deal. And I sat down and I asked Dave kind of the question you asked, and I said, Dave, blogging was so wonderful at the beginning. We got along. We had blog roles linking to each other, and we were civilized. I said, what happened, Dave? And he said, Jeff, everything's good when it starts.
Everything?
At least that was.
You always seem to me someone sort of caught halfway between the university and innovation and startups. Do you ever regret not throwing yourself full-time into a media startup?
I think I'm chicken shit. I did start a magazine called Entertainment Weekly. I did that at Time Inc. because there's no way you could have started a magazine. It went through more than hundreds of millions of dollars before it broke even, and that will never happen again. And I started things within companies, within Advanced Publications. I started their half dozen local news sites. I helped and was there when Conde Nast started. So I've started 3 new degrees in universities. I love starting things, but I'm probably too old and too chicken to do it on my own.
You mentioned Nick Denton, who I'm not sure if he was bankrupted, but certainly severely wounded by Peter Thiel. Are the winners over the last 20 years, are they the Thiels and the Musks? Are there any good guys who have won in the digital space and technology over the last 20 years, Jeff?
Yeah, I think there are. I think Matt Mullenweg.
Although he's not a big winner, is he? I mean, he's the WordPress guy.
He's WordPress, and WordPress now serves 40% of the web, and it's worth a lot.
What do you mean serves? What does that mean?
Are WordPress sites. It's a tremendously powerful force.
So it's sort of an equivalent of Squarespace in that sense.
It's much bigger than Squarespace, yeah. I think that Craig Newmark was a winner, and Craig, starting Craigslist, and he's a friend of mine, decided early on that he was going to be a philanthropist of classified ads, and he charges for very little. And yes, he competed with newspapers, but so did the internet as a whole. And he built something that's wonderful, and now he's a philanthropist. I think there are some good guy winners like that.
Yeah, we'll have to get Newmark on the show. I'd be curious. I mean, he is in a sense a parable. Craigslist did remarkably well early on, and he had a degree of guilt because of its impact on the newspaper business, so he poured a lot of the profits back into non-profit journalistic initiatives.
I don't think he's guilty. No, I don't think that's the analysis. I think that he's a critic of media and wants it to be better, and that's why he invests in it.
Where are we in 2025, Jeff, on the media landscape? I know you're not necessarily a huge fan of most of the dominant national newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post. But back in 2005, their online presence was minimal. Today, they're much more sophisticated and successful.
What I've been chronicling in my work, I find, in the Gutenberg parenthesis in a book I wrote about magazines called Magazine, in the book I'm working on about the linotype, I end up chronicling the arc of mass media. And I think that what we're seeing is the end of the long century of mass media. And that includes, in the long run, the incumbent institutions. And so I think that they and their old business model will go at some point. And it's going to be messy. Clay Shirky at NYU always talks about that. There's never a clean transition. And we see a lot of interesting, good innovation happening out there in media, but it's going to be spotty, and it's going to take time to develop, and bad guys will get away with things because they're not being watched. So it's not going to be an easy transition at all. But I think we're at the point of transition in media where mass media, in the form of magazines, in the form of broadcast television, broadcast radio, old-time newspapers, are all at the point of shrinking into obsolescence.
But isn't, in that sense, history repeating itself? Mark Benioff bought Time, Elon Musk bought Twitter, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. They're basically rich guys who like playing with media in the same way as the Hearst and Citizen Kane and the Pulitzers. Why is it any different from any other time in history?
The difference is that then it was media on the upswing, and now it's media going down. And so you have rich guys who think that they're going to rescue media, but then there is no white knight. Jeff Bezos, according to Marty Baron, the former editor of the Washington Post, was a great steward, but then Jeff Bezos did what he did with the endorsement in the middle of the election. Patrick Soon-Shiong was said to have saved the LA Times, but then he's been doing some weird stuff around his paper. I don't think that there are white knights who can come in and save any old publication. I think we have to reinvent journalism and media for this new reality and this new age.
Speak briefly about AI. I mean, too much is said of AI. Is this really the only story in 2025? Is it going to reshape your world of media?
It is. I'm working on new programs to teach students about AI. I'm working on a course in AI and creativity. I think AI is an incredibly important story. And AI's been around. Google's been using AI like crazy. Every time you do a spell check, every time you use maps, every time an ad is shown to you, AI's involved. AI's been there. What's different, of course, is 2 years ago came ChatGPT, and with it, the literate machine. The machine that we could talk to, that could talk back to us, that we could instruct to do what we wanted with our language. Languages. And I think that's what's fundamentally different. It has a basic and fundamental change in communication, and communication, as a friend of mine said recently, is the central nervous system of society. And so I think we're not near getting our heads around what that's going to mean for us when something new, not someone new, has entered public discourse.
And how is it playing itself out in the politics? You're not shy in your criticism of Trump and support of Kamala Harris. Why is it that the Republicans, in an odd kind of way, seem more open to innovation these days than the Democrats?
I think it's gone back and forth and back and forth. Howard Dean was the first really great online candidate, and then it became the Republicans, the Democrats again, the Republicans. I think it's just a game of leapfrog that goes on. I don't think that they have anything that's necessarily and inherently more innovative than the other side.
And when you look around the world, we've talked about Germany. What's your take on, your new book is about moral hysteria. What's your concern on the current hysteria over China and Chinese internet companies?
I think it's overblown. I think TikTok is a great innovation. I believe that TikTok is the first truly native internet and interactive application because it enables people to collaborate in a way that wasn't possible before. I like TikTok. I'm on it every day. I think the moral panic over it being Chinese is ridiculous. Whether we use Huawei phones or not, I think may have an impact at a very high level of espionage, but not at the consumer level, really. Could the Chinese learn about things about us? Yeah, sure, but they can do it anyway. They can buy data. We have huge data stores in this country that we've had since the days of print magazines. I work with them at Time Inc. That you can get, that's available, and the Chinese can get that for the matter of a few dollars. So I don't think that they're the great threat that they're being painted as. The thing is that politicians need threats and enemies so they can save us from them.
Are there threats, though, in 2025? Or some of the other people in this series have talked about what they see as the existential threat of global warming, of a shift to authoritarian, anti-democratic politics. What concerns you in 2025?
What concerns me more than anything is fascism, not just at the door, but now in the door. I've been rereading Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, and I wish journalists would read it everywhere. Because, and I'm not trying to argue that there's an exact parallel here, but there are lessons to be learned from the past. Journalists say that they write the first draft of history, but that too often means they ignore history. And we've got to look back to the lessons from Germany and the Soviet Union and understand how totalitarian regimes work, but also how populations are made vulnerable to them and their siren call because they are alienated from society. Arendt talks about the loneliness people feel, and I don't mean loneliness in the sense of the Surgeon General whining about it or about incel people not being able to get a date. I mean a profound loneliness of not being connected to society. And so this makes me wonder how to rethink journalism, a journalism of belonging. And I don't know how to do that, but I think that's the crisis that makes us vulnerable right now. It has its roots in racism and misogyny and fear and a lack of education. And the only real cure to me is education.
But in that Arendtian sense, isn't then the challenge for the digital revolution over the next 20 years, between 2025 and 2045, of strengthening the intermediary institutions, the schools, the churches, the labor unions, the local government that stands between the individual and the state, because that seems to be the core of Arendt's argument about totalitarianism. The
end of my book, The Gutenberg Parenthesis, is about the institutional revolution, and I came to the notion that we have seen a 180-degree flip in the definitions of conservative and progressive. Conservatives were there to conserve, to protect institutions from change. Progressives were there to change those institutions. But what's happening now is the so-called right wing, the so-called conservatives, are all about destroying the institutions of society, government, fair elections, medicine, science, and so on. That puts the progressives in the position of being the defenders of these institutions. And so the question is, how do we best defend those institutions? I think we must. I think we do so by updating them, by making them more, by changing them so that they are more responsive to the needs of society and more resilient against these kinds of threats.
Well, cast your mind forward, Jeff, to 2045. I'm going to give you utopian license. Dream out loud. Tell us what you'd like the future to be like. 20 years is a long time, certainly in Silicon Valley. It's several centuries in normal historical terms. What could the world be like in 2045 if Jeff Jarvis's dreams were realized?
I just hope that we relearn the skills of holding public conversation and personal responsibility. In writing my current book, The Web We Weave, I went down a wonderful rabbit hole, and I asked, what did people do before the internet to find credible, authoritative voices and information. And there was a social system that was called fama, it is said. And it really meant that people had to maintain their credibility and their authority and their reputation for credibility, whether they were the source of information, the subject of it, the spreader of it, or the recipient of it. And that responsibility falls back on us all now individually. We can't just rely on one newspaper to find everything true in the world, or Walter Cronkite to say, and that's the way it is. We instead have to take on the responsibility ourselves to decide whom and what we believe. That's not easy. That will come through education and critical thinking. And my hope is that the destruction of education will not occur and people will realize that we need education in society.
Isn't the crisis then one sort of an ironic duality of trust? On the one hand, we don't trust external sources, traditional journalists, the Walter Cronkite model that you don't really mourn. On the other hand, we seem to trust perhaps ourselves or certainly our associates too much. If we are to have a Jeff Jarvis friendly 2045, do we need to recalibrate trust somehow?
Yes, I think we do. I think we have to decide that it's possible to trust. A lot of talk around media was teaching media literacy and news literacy. Dana Boyd, who's a brilliant researcher now going to Cornell, argued that the problem with media literacy is we taught our young people to distrust everything. And there are some things in some institutions you want them to trust, including their educators, including journalists, including, you would hope, a decent government. And so we have to find, you're right, Andrew, I think that balance in deciding that there is a possibility to trust again. I think what's happening in parts of the country and the world right now is people are saying they can trust nothing. That's not sustainable.
And finally, I hope you and I are both around in 2045, ideally you sitting in the front row at DLD. What would you like to accomplish over the next 20 years? I know you're still very active in writing books. Do you have a number of projects you'd like to achieve in the next 20 years?
So I've left City University of New York. I'm now working with Stony Brook University in New York and Montclair State University in New Jersey. I'm still affiliated officially with CUNY because I'm emeritus, which is Latin for old. And I hope to be able to continue to start programs, which I would love to do and I'm working on. I think I'll keep writing some books. I want to write about the death of mass media. I'm writing a book now about the linotype and the beginnings of mass media. And otherwise, I might try to learn how to retire.
Well, Jeff Jarvis, please don't retire. We need you. Thank you so much and I'm thanking you on behalf of Steffi at DLD. I hope to see you for many years in the future in the front row of DLD. Thank you so much.
Hi, Steffi.